Thank you for coming to the bloodborne pathogen for February 2021.
You see, officer, they keep harassing me. And look, right there.
I gotta tell you, sir, this is the most bizarre case I've ever seen.
You're telling me?
Okay, well, tell you what, we have your information. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Hey, Dave, somebody threw up on the bus.
Oh, okay. Thanks for coming to me. Now, don't touch it. This is a great time to talk about bloodborne pathogens.
Gonna be here a while.
Now, wait, just the OSHA exposure to bloodborne pathogen standard requires that employers in industries where exposure to bloodborne pathogens is reasonably foreseeable, like in healthcare, take steps to minimize or eliminate the risk of exposure. For example, regulated employers must establish a written exposure control plan and are likely to be required to implement engineering and work practice controls to ensure that workers are provided and use appropriate personal protective equipment, and adopt certain housekeeping procedures that foster a clean and sanitary work environment. OSHA has regulated occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens for several years. If it's possible that you could be exposed to blood or other potentially infectious materials, you need to be aware of this standard.
The Bloodborne Pathogen Program is designed to make everyone aware of the regulatory requirements of the Bloodborne Pathogen Standard 29 CFR 1910.1030. It covers all employers who require employees to perform duties that might expose them to bloodborne pathogens. Because our employees could potentially be exposed to bloodborne pathogens, this program is part of our ECP, Exposure Control Program.
Right, and MV's policy for employees is to call for assistance and to be hands-off. But I know that I have to adhere to specific record keeping if I'm exposed.
That's right, Kurt, and you did the right thing. In an emergency situation, drivers and operators should avoid getting involved, if possible, and instead call dispatch or see a manager. We will determine the severity of the situation and notify the appropriate emergency, fire, or police authorities.
So, has anyone been in an emergency situation before? What happened? How did you handle it? Well, I know firsthand when someone gets in the emergency situation, like cutting your fingers or stabbing yourself in the hand. Um, First thing you need to know is notify the dispatcher that's on duty and the supervisor. They can call the proper 911 proper emergency, including the EMT arriving at the location.
Well, thank you, Kurt. I can take it from here, Guy. A lot of workers in the healthcare industry and other fields are exposed to bloodborne pathogens, pathogenic microorganisms that are present in human blood. Exposure to bloodborne pathogens can cause serious disease in humans. Among the most troublesome bloodborne pathogens are hepatitis B virus, HBV, which causes serious liver disease, and human immune deficiency virus, HIV, which of course causes AIDS. You won't know if anyone has one of these viruses, so it's important that you minimize contact with blood-containing body fluids. Bloodborne pathogens are transmitted when contaminated blood or body fluids, including vomit, enter the body of another person. Now, this can occur through a number of ways. An accidental puncture by a sharp object contaminated with the pathogen. Open cuts or skin abrasions coming in contact with contaminated blood or body fluids. Sexual contact or indirect transmission, meaning that a person touches dried or caked on blood and then touches the eyes, mouth, nose, or an open cut.
My guys all know in any emergency situation involving blood or potentially infectious materials, you are not required by MV to do anything. The division's utility personnel will clean the bus using the appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, to protect themselves from bloodborne pathogens using universal precautions. Universal precautions is an infection control approach where all human blood and certain body fluids are treated as if they were known to be infectious. In other words, if it is wet and it is not yours, do not touch it, no matter what color it is. Examples of body fluid that could be infected with bloodborne pathogens are blood, semen, vaginal secretions, cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, pleural fluid, unfixed skin or tissue, living or dead.
Because of the nature of exposure incidents, it's imperative that you use the personal protective equipment that's appropriate, such as goggles, glasses, or face shield, latex gloves, or smocks to protect yourself from exposure incidents. An exposure incident is defined: a specific eye, mouth, or other mucous membrane, non-intact skin, or parenteral contact with blood or other potentially infectious materials, abbreviated OPIM, that results from the performance of an employee's duties.
Well, just because a person contacts body fluids containing blood doesn't mean it was an exposure incident. If safety measures are taken, the PPE isn't damaged and there's no penetration of mucous membranes or open skin surfaces, it's not considered an occupational exposure.
Sure, so keep in mind that for a company to be responsible for an exposure incident, the exposure must have resulted from required duties performed within the company. Now, personal protective equipment is chosen based on the anticipated exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. Protective equipment works to protect you by preventing blood or other potentially infectious materials from passing through or reaching your clothing, skin, eyes, mouth, or other mucous membrane. Personal protective equipment is located in the shop or the shop office at your division.
He's right. And our personal protective equipment includes, but is not limited to, gloves. Latex or vinyl gloves are provided. Bandages. Employees can cover any open cuts, sores, abrasions, chapping, or wounds on their skin with a bandage. Face shields and eye protection. Masks, eye protection, or chin-length face shields are worn whenever people's eyes, nose, or mouth might be splashed by body fluids or cleaning solutions. Grabbers and tongs. As much as possible, employees need to use grabbers or tongs and gloves to pick up potentially infectious materials. Gloves must be worn before picking up these materials. Paper towels, used to clean up potentially infectious matter. Red bags. You have to put all disposable, non-sharp, contaminated, or possibly contaminated waste in red bags. Sharps containers. Put all sharp objects, like broken glass, needles, small sharp steel, into a sharps container. Do not recap needles. Employees have to wear gloves while cleaning equipment which might have been exposed to potentially infectious body fluids. After cleaning equipment, employees should discard the gloves. We all have to follow certain procedures for cleaning and decontaminating the environment, equipment, and work surfaces, and for handling contaminated laundry and regulated waste. This standard also requires that our work sites are clean and sanitary. Work surfaces in the shop or on a bus contaminated with blood or OPIM must be decontaminated with an appropriate disinfectant immediately or as soon as possible. We train our employees in accordance with the regulatory requirements. The training takes place prior to working with potential exposures and then is repeated at least annually.
All right, so an exposure incident is defined as a specific eye, mouth, or other mucous membrane, non-intact skin, or parenteral contact with blood or other potentially infectious materials that results from the performance of an employee's duty.
What if you get blood or bodily fluids on your clothes? What are we supposed to do?
Good question, Kurt. That's an important point. That happened to one of our drivers. He was helping a passenger secure the front of her mobility device, and okay, this is a little gross, but she wasn't feeling well and she threw up on our driver.
Ugh.
Yeah, well, anyway, he had to act as if she had a bloodborne pathogen, even if she didn't. That way he was safe. He immediately contacted dispatch to switch out his vehicle, and then, as fast as he could, washed his hands and anywhere that came into contact with those fluids. If this happens to you, be sure to clean it completely off. Hydrogen peroxide is good to use. If you use the infectious control kit in the vehicle, you have to report it to your safety or operations manager so the kit can be replenished. Any materials like towels, gauze, or gloves with fluids, blood, or pus need to be disposed of in a red biohazard container. If it is a small amount of liquid and it's completely absorbed and cannot be wrung or squeezed out, put it in a red biohazard bag and throw the material away in an outside dumpster. If blood is splashed in your eye or mucous membranes, flush the affected areas with running water for at least 15 minutes. Report the exposure to your supervisor as soon as possible. Any surface that was exposed should be disinfected immediately. Operators and/or dispatch have to communicate to maintenance if something happened on the bus, meaning all blood or body fluid spills, so it can get cleaned up immediately. I make sure that my maintenance shop is aware of the procedures for handling infectious materials with the proper PPE. MV's Bloodborne Pathogen Exposure Control Plan complies with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's, or OSHA's, Bloodborne Pathogen Standard to eliminate or minimize our employees' exposure to blood, certain other body fluids, or other potentially infectious materials.
You can always ask your supervisor if you want to read over our exposure control plan. A copy of it should be printed and in the OSHA compliance binder.
Where can you find a copy of the MV exposure control plan? Well, you can always ask your supervisor if you want to read over our exposure control plan. A copy of it should be run out and placed in an OSHA compliance binder. So maintenance, contact your lead or your manager, maintenance manager, for the copy of the MV exposure control plan, if you'd like to read over.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'll be on my...
Sit down and listen, Kurt.
I'm not even in maintenance.
Unimportant. You do know that drivers should simply contain any spill in the bus by laying down some absorbent and then bringing your vehicle back to the yard for a changeout, right? Now, if utility personnel may be exposed to a bloodborne pathogen, the hepatitis B vaccine shall be made available after you have received the required training, and no more than 10 working days after your initial assignment. The vaccine shall be offered at no cost. The hepatitis B vaccination is a series of 3 injections that is effective in preventing infection with hepatitis B. There will be a post-exposure evaluation and follow-up after the incident. If you should decline the hepatitis B vaccination, you will be asked to simply sign a form that states you waived your opportunity to receive the vaccination. Because you can never be sure when an exposure incident will happen, it's important that you use and understand communications that explain any hazards. The best way we do this are signs that have the appropriate words of warning, labels with biohazard symbols, and any other appropriate visual warnings. Any container that may store potentially infectious materials must be adequately labeled. Refrigerators should be labeled, and employees must make certain that no food items are placed in refrigerators that contain biohazards. All wastes must be labeled in accordance with EPA requirements for biohazard wastes. All medical and training records related to bloodborne pathogens must be maintained. And it's also important that the relevant records contain the appropriate information. Failure to document this information could result in possible fines for regulatory violations. There are two types of records, medical and training. And these records are to be kept separate, and they are never to be combined. Medical records. These include physicians' evaluations of employees, exposure and incident reports, and medical follow-up, and they must include the employee's name, social security number, hepatitis B vaccination status, post-exposure evaluation and follow-up results, and any healthcare professional's written opinion, healthcare specific information.
Yes. And we keep training records on all of this.
Really? Like what?
Training records include all levels of training related to bloodborne pathogens and have to include training dates. I'm putting today's date right here. Contents of the training, name and qualifications of the trainer, and the name and job titles of the trainees.
Hey man, I'm sorry I threw up on the bus. Ah! Ah!
It's okay. No. You're the paramedic.
I'm not a paramedic. I'm a bus passenger and a sick one.
Get out.
Get out! Out, out, out!
Get out.
Well, this little thing notwithstanding, thanks for your attention during this very important course this month. And join us next month when things really get hot. We'll talk about heat safety.
Question number 1, bloodborne pathogens are A, viable means of transmission, B, an infection control approach, or C, accidents everyone encounters. So the right answer is B, an infection control approach. You should always treat all bodily fluid as if they are infectious and avoid direct contact with them, true or false. Answer number 2 is true. Bloodborne pathogens. As a driver or operator, if someone is bleeding on your bus, A, you can clean it yourself. B, call dispatch or 911. Or C, let another passenger help. The right answer is B. Number 4, only maintenance should clean your bus after someone has been bleeding or threw up. The answer is true. MV's policy for employees concerning a bloodborne pathogen is A, to help immediately, B, to call for assistance and to be hands off, or C, to avoid direct skin contact. Answer on number 5 is B, to call for assistance and to be hands off. Just for a final recap, just make sure if you are going to help someone, make sure you wear gloves first. Call dispatch for assistance. Always practice universal precaution. Always assume everybody's infected. Thank you for the February 2021 safety meeting.